I have spent the last 72 hours reviewing strike telemetry data, Ukrainian security service intercept reports, and 3 separate classified post-engagement assessments that have quietly circulated within NATO's senior planning staffs. And I need to be completely direct with you about what they reveal, because what you are being told by mainstream media is a carefully curated fragment of a far more dangerous operational reality. The headline you saw said Russia fired missiles at Ukraine. What the headline did not say, what it structurally cannot say without triggering the kind of panic that disrupts bond markets and defense appropriation cycles, is that on January 9, 2026, Russia deployed its Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile system in a live, fully armed, non-nuclear configuration against a target in the Lviv region, barely miles from the Polish border. This was not a test. This was not a demonstration. This was a deliberate, calibrated, kinetic message delivered at Mach 10 to every NATO defense planner sitting in Brussels, Norfolk, and Washington, D.C. What the mainstream narrative is completely missing is the architectural implications of this deployment. They are covering the diplomatic outrage, the EU calling it escalatory and unacceptable, the emergency UN Security Council sessions, the condemnations from London, Paris, and Berlin. All of that noise is designed, intentionally or not, to draw your eye away from the single most important tactical fact of the last 4 years of this war. The Oreshnik missile, operating in its conventional configuration, cannot currently be intercepted by any air defense system NATO has deployed or has in production. Let me be precise about what that means. The entire Western air defense investment thesis, billions of dollars of Patriot PAC-3 batteries, billions more in SAMP-T systems, Germany's procurement cycle, Romania's expansion, is predicated on an adversary missile threat that travels at speeds and terminal flight profiles for which these systems were designed. The Oreshnik operates outside that design envelope, categorically, completely. And here's the part that should concern every macro investor and defense analyst watching this. Russia has now deployed the Oreshnik system in Belarus, dramatically compressing the geographic buffer between Russia's hypersonic strike capability and the core infrastructure of NATO's eastern flank. This is not an evolution of the conflict. This is a structural break, and the West's defense architecture has not adapted. Not yet. To understand why this deployment constitutes a genuine paradigm rupture rather than simply another escalatory rung on a long ladder, one must strip away the political language and return to the immutable laws of physics, geography, and logistics that govern modern warfare. The Eastern European theater presents a fundamental and deeply inconvenient problem for Western defensive doctrine. NATO's eastern flank, stretching from the Baltic states through Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, is geographically compressed. The distances between potential launch points on Russian or Belarusian territory and high-value NATO logistics nodes, rail hubs, port facilities, and airfields are measured not in hours, but in minutes of flight time for a hypersonic system. The Patriot PAC-3 missile defense battery, NATO's primary terminal phase interceptor, requires a minimum engagement window to acquire, track, classify, and kinetically intercept an inbound threat. Against a conventional ballistic or cruise missile traveling at subsonic to low supersonic speeds, that window is operationally sufficient. Against the Oreshnik, which travels to its target at Mach 10 like a meteorite and is described by Russia as immune to any missile defense system, that window collapses to a time frame that current sensor-to-shooter kill chains cannot reliably service. The physics are unforgiving. A projectile traveling at Mach 10 covers approximately 3.4 kilometers per second. From a launch point in Belarus to Warsaw, Reshaw, or the critical NATO logistics hub at Ramstein-adjacent infrastructure, the entire flight timeline is compressed below the threshold where a networked, multi-layer air defense architecture can execute a high-confidence intercept with currently fielded technology. This is not a theoretical vulnerability, it is a doctrinal exposure, and it is compounded by the terrain and infrastructure reality of the region. Eastern Poland's logistics network, the critical supply arteries through which Western military aid has been flowing into Ukraine for nearly 4 years, runs through a constrained corridor of road and rail infrastructure. Lviv, the city proximate to the most recent Oreshnik strike, is not simply a Ukrainian city. It is the operational funnel through which NATO material enters the conflict zone. Western military aid flows to Ukraine from a supply hub in Poland just across the border. Russia has now demonstrated in live operational conditions that it can place a hypersonic kinetic payload within that funnel, with current air defenses unable to contest the approach. Furthermore, Western military doctrine is built on the assumption of air superiority as a force-enabling condition. Ground-based air defense supplements, but does not replace the air superiority umbrella that allows logistics, close air support, and command infrastructure to function. Against hypersonic delivery systems operating at the top of the flight envelope, the concept of a permissive aerial environment for NATO logistics becomes, in practical terms, a contingency assumption rather than an operational guarantee. The entire layered defense model, the doctrine that has underpinned NATO's collective defense planning since the Cold War, was architected against a threat matrix that has now been materially superseded. The Oreshnik, its designation translating literally to hazelnut tree in Russian, a name whose mundanity belies its destructive architecture, is not a single weapon. It is a delivery system belonging to a class of intermediate-range ballistic missiles that Russia developed partly as a direct response to the United States' withdrawal from the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. Understanding its technical construction is essential to understanding why NATO's existing defensive investments are structurally mismatched against it. The Oreshnik operates on a multiple independent re-entry vehicle, or MRV, platform. This means that rather than delivering a single warhead on a single terminal trajectory, the system releases a cluster of independently guided re-entry vehicles, commonly estimated at 6 warheads per salvo, each following a distinct terminal flight path to a discrete aim point. This MIRV architecture is the first critical tactical problem it presents. A Patriot PAC-3 battery operates with a finite magazine of interceptor rounds and a fire control radar with limits on its simultaneous engagement tracks. A single Oreshnik launch forces that battery to allocate interceptors across multiple, simultaneously inbound, independently maneuvering re-entry vehicles. The mathematics of this engagement rapidly favor the attacker. The second critical problem is the terminal phase electromagnetic profile. The Kinzhal and Zircon hypersonic missiles, and by architectural extension, the Oreshnik, maintain their radar-defeating plasma layer through the terminal phase when striking static targets. This plasma sheath, generated by the extreme aerodynamic heating of hypersonic flight, creates a blackout effect around the vehicle that degrades the radar cross-section. The intercepting system relies upon to maintain a targeting lock through the kinetic intercept sequence. In practical terms, the target fades from the tracking radar precisely when the intercept solution needs to be most precise. The result is a miss, or at minimum, a dramatically degraded intercept probability. In early 2024, Russian and Ukrainian sources reported the employment of Zircon hypersonic missiles in Ukraine, with officials claiming Patriots intercepted only 1 Zircon, a stark departure from this system's typically high intercept rate. That single data point, drawn from live combat conditions, fundamentally undermines the strategic rationale for continuing to scale Patriot procurement as NATO's primary answer to the Russian hypersonic threat. Several countries, including Germany and Romania, are actively pursuing additional Patriot batteries, while the United States is investing in expanding interceptor and platform production, an expanded focus that consumes large amounts of precious capital with little tangible alternative if a superior weapon renders that investment obsolete. Now layer on top of this the Oreshnik's confirmed deployment posture. The January 9th strike on the Lviv region targeted an underground natural gas storage facility, not a frontline military installation, but a piece of strategic energy infrastructure positioned in western Ukraine, adjacent to the NATO supply corridor. This target selection is tactically deliberate and strategically communicative on multiple levels. First, it demonstrates that the system's accuracy at operational range is sufficient to hold specific, hardened subsurface infrastructure at risk. Second, it demonstrates that the Oreshnik's kinetic payload, in its conventional configuration, using real explosive warheads for the first time, generates sufficient energy on target to threaten reinforced underground facilities. Putin has previously warned that several Oreshnik missiles used in a conventional strike could be as devastating as a nuclear attack. Third, and this is the detail that serious strategic planners will fixate on, the target's proximity to Poland was not incidental. It was the message. The missiles hit close to Poland, which is a member of NATO. Back in November 2024, the missiles hit Dnipro, which is in east-central Ukraine and is not close to Ukraine's borders with other countries. The geographic progression from Dnipro to Lviv is a deliberate walk toward NATO's tripwire. Russia is exercising its hypersonic strike envelope in live combat conditions, incrementally closer to Article 5 territory, and doing so with a system that NATO cannot currently intercept. The saturation attack dimension compounds this further. The Oreshnik strike was embedded within a larger barrage that included hundreds of Shahed-class loitering munitions and conventional ballistic missiles, a deliberate multi-axis, multi-domain saturation package designed to overwhelm Ukrainian integrated air defense by forcing simultaneous engagement across disparate threat categories. This is the emerging Russian operational template: exhaust interceptor magazines and sensor attention with cheap, high-volume drone swarms, then deliver precision hypersonic payloads into the gaps created by that attrition. It is asymmetric warfare executed at scale, using a layered kinetic architecture that converts NATO's interceptor cost-per-shot advantage into a liability. The geopolitical and macroeconomic reverberations of Russia's Oreshnik deployment extend far beyond the Ukrainian theater and will manifest across multiple asset classes, insurance markets, and the structural architecture of the post-Cold War international order with a directness that most civilian analysts are not yet pricing in. Begin with the most immediate financial impact vector: European energy infrastructure risk. The Lviv gas storage strike was not random. Ukraine's underground gas storage network is one of the largest in Europe, with a total working capacity that historically serves not only Ukrainian domestic consumption, but also acts as a strategic buffer for Central and Eastern European gas supply during peak demand periods. A successful hypersonic strike that disables or destroys a significant node in that network does not merely inconvenience Ukraine, it introduces supply shock dynamics into German, Slovak, Austrian, and Hungarian energy markets. European natural gas futures markets are acutely sensitive to Ukrainian infrastructure integrity. Any sustained Russian hypersonic campaign against Ukrainian energy storage will transmit directly into European energy prices, which remain elevated above pre-2022 norms and continue to impose structural inflationary pressure on EU industrial competitiveness. Zoom out further to maritime insurance and global shipping. The Black Sea remains a constrained but critical corridor for Ukrainian grain and commodity exports, and the insurance market for vessels transiting that corridor has already undergone dramatic repricing since 2022. The demonstration of a Russian hypersonic capability that can strike within miles of a NATO border, with current air defenses unable to interdict it, will force Lloyd's of London and the broader war risk insurance market to reevaluate the risk premium, not only for Black Sea transit, but for Baltic Sea operations as well. When the perceived range of effective Russian kinetic reach expands to envelope NATO-adjacent sea lanes, insurers respond by raising war risk premiums. When war risk premiums rise, shipping costs rise. When shipping costs rise, the price of everything that moves by sea, commodities, manufactured goods, food, rises with it. For macro investors, the structural investment implication is this: the Patriot PAC-3 procurement cycle, which has driven significant revenue and margin expansion for Raytheon Technologies, now RTX Corporation, and its European partners, is being materially challenged by the operational evidence emerging from Ukraine. The urgency to address the hypersonic threat grows more pressing because NATO has doubled down on investments in the Patriot system following its relative success against conventional Russian missiles and drones. Yet Russia's hypersonic weapons are increasing their effectiveness against it. This creates a defense investment paradox. The system eating the largest share of European defense budgets is demonstrably less effective against the most acute current threat. Capital allocation within defense portfolios will need to rotate toward directed energy, space-based sensor architecture, and next-generation hypersonic intercept programs, none of which are at meaningful production scale within a 5-year horizon. At the structural geopolitical level, the Oreshnik deployment accelerates the erosion of the unipolar deterrence architecture that has governed great power relations since 1991. The foundational assumption of NATO deterrence theory is that the collective military technological superiority of the alliance renders aggressive military action against its members or interests prohibitively costly for any adversary. Russia's fielding of a hypersonic system that NATO cannot currently intercept, deployed in live combat within miles of alliance territory, directly challenges that cost imposition calculus. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha characterized the strike near the EU and NATO border as a grave threat to the security on the European continent and a test for the transatlantic community. It is precisely that, a live-fire test of whether the transatlantic community can impose costs on Russia for hypersonic coercion. And as of January 2026, the answer emerging from the operational data is deeply uncomfortable for alliance planners. I want to leave you with the dilemma that is sitting on the desk of every serious strategic planner in NATO's command structure right now, because there is no clean answer, only two paths, each carrying its own category of catastrophic risk. Path 1. NATO accelerates. The alliance fast-tracks directed energy programs, massively invests in space-based missile tracking constellations, and, critically, begins extending Article 5 deterrence language to cover hypersonic strikes on NATO-adjacent infrastructure. This path risks direct miscalculation with a nuclear-armed Russia that has already signaled it views the Oreshnik as a sub-nuclear strategic instrument. One miscalculation in that environment does not stay conventional. Path 2. NATO absorbs. The alliance continues the current posture, diplomatic condemnation, incremental aid, Patriot procurement cycles that are structurally outpaced by the threat, while hoping negotiated frameworks emerge before Russia normalizes hypersonic coercion as a standard operational tool. This path surrenders deterrence credibility incrementally until the cost of restoring it becomes prohibitive. I do not believe there is a third path that does not involve one of those two forcing functions asserting itself before the end of this decade. The timeline is compressing, the technology is deployed, the engagement data is unambiguous. Tell me in the comments below, which path do you assess as the least catastrophically wrong? I want your tactical read on this. If this briefing provided clarity you are not getting anywhere else, subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's briefing goes deeper into the directed energy countermeasure programs that are racing to answer the Oreshnik problem before it becomes permanent.